All right, so welcome back to philosophy. What I want to do today is talk a bit about what philosophy is. So give an introduction to the various fields of philosophy and have us think a bit about, what philosophy is in general, kind of the approach to life that philosophy takes, the kind of thinking that goes into doing philosophy. So that's where I'm headed. So to begin with, I want us to just stop and think about how we use the word philosophy in our lives. You probably use the word on a regular, semi-regular basis. You talk about somebody having their own life philosophy, or a person's philosophy in doing this thing, is X, Y, or Z, right? We use the word philosophy to talk about what it is that is guiding our behavior. We can even talk about the way, like somebody's philosophy in driving, right? You might be a defensive driver, and that's your philosophy in driving, that you're going to, drive particularly cautiously, or maybe your philosophy is more aggressive driving, right? Those are different philosophies in the way that one drives. Maybe as a student, right, you have a particular philosophy maybe your philosophy is that you spend a certain amount of time every day studying, and you sort of put your books away and that's it. Maybe you spend a lot of time cramming right before exams. It could be, whatever your philosophy happens to be, that's the approach you take to studying as a student. A parent, right? A parent has a certain philosophy in parenting. The way that they approach raising children. We have philosophies for all sorts of things. So if we think about how we use that word in those different contexts, right, we tend to be using it to describe something about how it is that we act, right? It's not the what we do, right, but it's the how we do those things. It's a certain set of sort of principles or values that tend to guide us, and that sort of idea of philosophy, that definition of philosophy, fits pretty well with what we mean by philosophy when we talk about it within the discipline itself. So I want to one more thing. When we talk about Socrates, which we'll get to, Socrates will be an example of how to live a philosophical life. So I wanted to sort of keep that in mind. We'll use Socrates as an example of the philosophical life. So we'll go ahead and share the screen and we'll get started. All right. I don't think I want to start there. I want to start at the top. There we go. Sorry, I have to get up here. Move a bit, get the lights turned back on. We're still done. You see my backdrop, Paul. Okay. So what is it? What is philosophy? So we can start by thinking about what the sort of breaking the word apart, what it means. We have a word. You can see that there's two words combined together, philo and sophy. And so to understand what philosophy is, one way to think about it is to define each parts of the word. So we're going to do what we call, we'll do that in a minute. I apologize. So let's first start with some definitions. These are definitions by several different philosophers. So the first here is by A.W. Moore. He says, "I'm hard pressed to say, but one thing that is certainly true is that what is philosophy is itself a strikingly philosophical question." Right? Sometimes we think about philosophy as trying to deal with questions that are really difficult, and here we have A.W. Moore basically saying that trying to define something like philosophy is itself quite difficult, if not impossible, to define satisfactorily for all people, or for all philosophers. The second, philosophy is taking as clearly as possible or thinking, excuse me, as clearly as possible at the most fundamental concepts that reach through all the disciplines. So you think about various disciplines, different areas of study. We think of sciences, and particularly we think of, like, say, biology, right? And when you look at biology, right, there's different concepts, like life itself, right? What does it mean for something to live, right? We say that bacteria are alive, and we may say that the viruses are not alive, right? What's the distinction between the two? Or species, for example, right? What is it to be a species, a separate species from another species, right? Is it just the ability to reproduce with one another, right? Is that too big or is that too small? Like we have different sort of questions around basic concepts, and so if you think of any particular discipline, area of study, they're all going to have sort of assumed concepts. Philosophy says, no, let's not assume, right? Let's think about those concepts and try to define what it is that they actually are, right? Let's come up with a definition of species, right, that everyone can agree to. So the third one here, a philosopher is a moral entrepreneur. It's a nice image. It's somebody who creates new ways of evaluating things. What's important, what's worthwhile. That changes how an entire culture or an entire people understand those things. So philosopher, a moral entrepreneur, like what might we mean by that? I think that if we want to give an example, we can think of the Enlightenment period and think of the people that sort of, founded the United States, right? They had various moral principles, notions of freedom that were important, use of reason, all of these different things that before perhaps were not defined in the same way. And in the Enlightenment, these ideas became really important, right? And so new concepts, new moral concepts, new notions of right and wrong, what it is to do right, what it is for something to be right, to be acceptable, what it is for something to be wrong, to be unacceptable, right? That changed when we moved from the medieval or the Renaissance period into the Enlightenment period. Okay, and finally, this one by David Papineau. Philosophy is thinking hard about the most difficult problems that there are. You might think scientists do that too, but there's a certain kind of question whose difficulty can't be resolved by getting more empirical evidence, right? We can't go out and just figure certain things out by gathering more evidence, like observing more things. It requires an untangling of presuppositions, right? Figuring out that our thinking is being driven by ideas we didn't even realize that we had. That's what philosophy is. So going back to my discussion about like a species, right? Perhaps science is being, I'm just going to leave it, I think it's okay. Perhaps science is being driven by a particular notion of species that has become no longer useful, no longer helpful, right? So okay, so let's look at that. Let's look at the presuppositions, like those basic things that are driving that, right? Perhaps a certain view of species helps us understand one thing, but not another, right? So for example, there's a lot more grizzlies and polar bears mating with one another, right? And so we perhaps before want to say that these are very distinct species, but what's going on now, right, is sort of showing that they are intermingling quite a bit. Right, so what does that say about species? Is our old definition or understanding of species helpful anymore? And we can sort of step back and think outside of science. We don't have to just think in terms of science. We can think in terms of of like sociological concepts, right, or anthropological concepts, right? What it means to be a society, right? Or if you think about like, what does it mean to be a community versus a particular human being, right? Are we social creatures first and foremost, and then individuals secondarily, or is it the reverse from that? So lots of different ways to sort of think about this. But philosophy, or at least one way of looking at philosophy, is it's trying to understand that. Okay, so here's the etymology. So I mentioned before, philosophy, right? Two different words here, philo and sophia. So in Greek, philo is one form of love, right? The Greek language is much more rich in its terms for what we call love, and one of those is philo. And the second part, Sophia, is wisdom or knowledge, but more broadly, when I think of wisdom, right? It's not just knowing facts. It's not just sort of having an encyclopedic knowledge of something. It's understanding how things are, how things work, perhaps why things are. So that's the etymology. Now, we'll talk about this a bit more when we get to Socrates, but one way of thinking about philosophy is we can think about it as a certain kind of way of life, right? We engage in, not behaviors so much, but certain habits as a philosopher, right? We're seeking truth, right? We're seeking knowledge, we're seeking truth, we're seeking understanding. And that's the type of life the philosopher lives, is a life of trying to understand themselves and understand the world about them. So that's one way of sort of thinking about this, the sort of etymological understanding of philosophy. After something, seeking something. So we think about what the importance of philosophy is, right? Philosophy, you could say, is just a discipline for people up in the ivory tower. It doesn't really have anything to do with real life. But I think that in this course, you'll see how philosophy can be really helpful for all of us, right? We have our own certain prejudices, and presuppositions, right? And so using philosophy to as the quote said, untangle those things, right? Understand what it is that we are relying on for our behaviors, right? I talked about different sort of driving philosophies. Well, what is it that's sort of behind us that gets us to drive a certain way, right? What is the sort of motivator for that kind of behavior? And when we get to talking about morality in particular, right? What is it that gets us to act in a certain moral way, right? To consider certain actions right, certain actions wrong, and other actions unimportant. You may think that giving generously, right, is an important virtue for you to hold. But then how is it that works, right? Does that mean that whenever someone asks you for money, you give them money, or help, you give them help, right? What does that have to do with, like certain boundaries that we may set up? Right, these are important questions, and philosophy helps us untangle this. Understanding our own philosophy helps us untangle how it is we ought to act in those particular situations. Okay, so what I want to do now is divide philosophy up into 5 different branches, right? Disciplines, different sub-disciplines of philosophy. So philosophy looks at a lot of different things. And professional philosophy as it's sort of understood today, the people that sort of call themselves academic philosophers, right? They work on different types of problems, different sorts of questions. And so we have people that call themselves metaphysicians, and we'll see that metaphysicians are concerned with things like, is the world all just one material thing, right? Or is there a spiritual dimension to it? Do human beings have souls, right? Or we're worried about questions about reason, right? Like, how is it that we can act rationally? What is it about the human mind that allows us to act rationally? So then we're talking about logic. So each discipline focuses on a different sort of aspect of the world and of ourselves. And so I want to spend time on each of these, and then we'll be, next time we'll be able to talk specifically about ethics. So metaphysics. The definition of metaphysics is the ultimate nature of reality. So what is concerned with is what the world, in sort of the big sense, right, with the universe, or even beyond the universe, if you want to think about it that way. What's the ultimate nature, the most basic way of understanding reality? What is it? What's it made of? And if you stop and you think about it, right, like you can say, okay, it's a bunch of energy, or it's a bunch of matter and energy, or whatever, right? But is that all, right? We talk about something like consciousness. What is consciousness? Is consciousness something that's real, right? Is it? Can we make sense of consciousness with a purely materialistic explanation, right? Or is there something beyond that materialistic explanation that we can use? So there's different areas of metaphysics that I want to mention to you. So these are the different sorts of things that metaphysicians ask questions about. So first, time, right? So time, if you think of what time is, and how it is that we might understand time. Now, one way of looking at time is in a very objective way. You have a clock, it can split time up into different segments, into different, time periods. And everyone's sort of running along that same that same sort of grid of time, right? We, when it's 5 o'clock, it's 5 o'clock for everybody. At least it's in the same time zone. But we also have a subjective experience of time, right? Where things change in our surroundings, right? We have a sense of moving through time, or time moving past us, or however it is that you want to look at time. And how time relates to something like space, right? Clearly there's some sort of relationship, because we recognize time by changes, by changes in the reality around us. So time is something that we can understand in various sorts of ways, and which of those is like the most ultimate nature of of time, right? And is time something that is ultimately real, right? Or is time something that is just the way we happen to see the world is through time? Freedom, free will. The question of free will is important, and we'll see it's really important for ethics. Now, if you take one particular view of what it means to be a human being, we can sort of think that I'm born from my parents, so I have a certain genetic makeup. They raised me a certain way, right? They teach me certain things. They feed me certain things. I happen to live in a certain place. I run into different people at different times in my life that affect what I do and what I don't do. And so we can ask, like, if we just sort of understood all of that, if we could totally understand all of those things, all those things that condition where I'm at right now, right? Could we totally predict it, right? Or can I decide? Can I make a decision to act in a different way, right? Now, of course, I feel like I'm making decisions. I experience myself as making free choices, but am I actually making free choices, right? Or is that just the experience, the feeling that I have? And for ethics, this is important, because if in fact I don't have free will and I can't have chosen differently, does it really make sense to talk about ethics, right? Because when we talk about ethics, we're talking about how one should act. But if there's only one way to act, right? If we can't act in any way other than the way I am acting, right? If I couldn't have chosen something differently, excuse me, then I can't really be held responsible, right? There's no sense in which I can be held responsible for my actions. So free will is important. And how to make sense of why it is or how it is that we might be free is an important question for philosophy. I already mentioned reality, right? You know, is reality all just one material thing, or is there sort of another, you know, reality that's made up of you know, mind or consciousness or something else? And then finally, God, the question of God, whether God exists or does not exist. And then if God does exist, what's the nature of that God, right? So beyond the question of God's existence, we can ask, what kind of sort of absolute or superior being is there, right? Is it a God that sort of wound up the clock and just lets it go, right? And so things are just sort of moving along according to some sort of mechanism, right? That was set up in the beginning of time, and that's whatever that is that set that up as God, right? Or is God a being that is sort of underlying all things, right? That sort of conditions all things all the time. Does God have a personality, right? Can we talk about God as having certain human-like attributes? Right? All important questions when it comes to God. So that's metaphysics. So that's about reality itself, right? What reality happens to be. You know, what kind of makes the world tick. Okay. Now there's another more abstract question, which is closely related to metaphysics, and that's the question of being. Oh, I apologize. So I forgot that I had these slides in here. So I'll mention these really quick. So first of all, so this is sort of looking at the relationship between these disciplines like metaphysics and ethics. So the first one here, reality, right? When it comes to ethics, there's a question about this concept, the good, right? This notion of justice, of right and wrong, and do these things actually exist, right? Or are they concepts that we create? And this is important because if they actually exist, if justice is something that's independent of the individual that is saying that this is just or unjust, right? If it's something independent of the one particular individual, then we might be able to say that a certain action is or is not just, right? Meaning that for example, if you see somebody take something from another person, right? And let's say, you know, you don't know either human being, either of these people, right? You can say, oh, well, that action was just, or that action was unjust. You can evaluate them based on this independent moral principle. It's pretty abstract, but that's kind of what we're talking about here. And then we'll come back to this over and over again. All right, free will, we already mentioned this. If we're not free, does it make sense for us to worry about ethics at all? Okay, so here we go. The more abstract discipline, then the metaphysics is the theory of being or existence. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about this, but just to sort of give you a sense of what it is. Ontology, right? Ontology wants to answer the question of what it means to actually exist, right? To be in existence. Like, what does that mean? And it's one of these questions you kind of have to stop and just like sit quietly with for a minute to let it sort of settle. But if we say that something is, right, or that something exists, what does that actually mean to say that? For example, right, like you may look on your desk or wherever you happen to be and see an object like a pen, a hat, right, piece of paper, or your computer or phone, and say that this exists, right? I can pick it up, I can feel its weight, I can break it if I want to, right? Like there's something to it, right? Okay, so that's fine, right? Like maybe that's easy. Maybe we say, okay, well, it's easy to say that material things exist. But what about something like money, right? You have a piece of paper and it says that it's, you know, has the number 20 on it. And we say that's a $20 bill and it has a particular value, right? We'll say, well, fine, you know, that's being represented by something in the US government, right? Or if we go back to when there was the silver and gold mints. Well, what says that silver, right, or gold has a certain value to it, right? What gives that its value, right? Sort of that's a ontological question around money, right? Does money actually exist? Time, right? Does time exist? Does the past exist? Does the future exist, or only the present? Right? Lots of different questions that come up here. Okay, so that's ontology. So now we're going to move into a couple areas that I think are particularly interesting and will be helpful for us. The first of these is epistemology. So epistemology is concerned with knowledge, right? What does it mean when we say that I know something, which you may think is pretty easy to know what that means, but it's not so easy, right? Because to say that I have knowledge of something, for example, to say that I know that Abraham Lincoln once lived, right? What does that mean to say that I know that? I've never seen Abraham Lincoln, and no one that I know has ever seen Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so there's no one in existence today that has seen Abraham Lincoln, that has met Abraham Lincoln. But I can say that I know that Abraham Lincoln exists, or I think that I can say that. Well, that's that knowledge that I have is based on someone else's experience, right? That I read it in a textbook and I rely on that textbook to tell me that Abraham Lincoln was a president of the United States, right? And to sort of have that knowledge means that I'm relying on something. I'm relying on testimony. Now we can say that testimony sometimes is right and sometimes it's wrong. You know, Abraham Lincoln's probably, probably really did exist. So I'm not really doubting whether or not Abraham Lincoln did exist at some point. What I am doubting, though, is whether or not I can have like absolute knowledge of that. right? Do I have enough certainty of that to say that I know that Abraham Lincoln did exist at one point? And you could say, well, maybe, maybe not, right? But what about 2 + 2 = 4? Okay, well, here we have something that's like completely abstract, right? 2 + 2 = 4. Well, mathematically we can prove that that's the case, and I can say, okay, I know that that is the case. But having knowledge of something like that seems to be very different than saying I have knowledge of the existence of Abraham Lincoln. So, we can ask all sorts of other questions, right? We're going to talk about two different types of knowledge, which maybe I think is on the next slide. Two different types of knowledge, or two different theories of knowledge. One is rationalism and one is empiricism. Now, the rationalists say that we have at least some knowledge that is independent of any experience, meaning that I can know it, this knowledge, whether or not I have any experience at all. And so the sort of key example of this is René Descartes, right? René Descartes is famous for saying, I think, therefore I. Now, what did he mean by this? He meant that if we attempt to doubt everything, we doubt our physical body, we doubt our senses, right? We doubt even our basic mathematical knowledge, right? We sort of like throw it all away, right? We keep digging and digging and digging, trying to doubt. We get to a point where there's something we can't doubt, right? And that which we cannot doubt, right, is going to be certain knowledge. Well, what is it? Well, for Descartes, he says that there's something that is doing all that doubting, right? And I happen to just term that thing that is doing that doubting I. And so he says, I think, or I doubt, therefore I am. And so the rationalists believe that we can have knowledge like that. The empiricists will say, no, that's not true knowledge, right? And that all the knowledge that we have is dependent on experience. We don't know something unless we've experienced it, unless we've come up with enough evidence to be certain that it's true, or believe that there's a high probability that it's true. So two different views of what counts as knowledge. Rationalism, at least some knowledge is independent of experience. Think mathematics. Empiricism, no, all knowledge is dependent on experience, right? Think of sort of scientific ways of knowing. Okay. So related to those is this division of types of knowledge, right? A priori, or independent of experience, and a posteriori, or dependent on experience. Now, both the rationalists and the empiricists will say that there's a priori and a posteriori knowledge. The empiricists will just say that the only a priori knowledge we can have is empty knowledge. So this example here, a bachelor is unmarried. Well, that's just the definition of what a bachelor is, right? Like, it just means an unmarried man. Like that's how we define that term. And so we don't actually learn anything when we say a bachelor is unmarried. Now, that's a priori, right? It's independent of any experience whatsoever. We don't have to have ever met a bachelor to know that that's the case. It's just what the definition is. Posteriori knowledge, on the other hand, is knowledge that's dependent on experience. So I can say that I know the sun will rise tomorrow. Now, we can ask how certain I can be of that, and I'm fairly certain that it will rise tomorrow. In fact, I'm incredibly certain that it will rise tomorrow. But how do I know that, right? I know that because of the experience I've had. Right? I know that the sun has always come up every day of my life, or every day that I remember. And people have told me, right, the sun has always come up, right? They never say like, oh, well, there just happened to be this day that the sun didn't come up. Right? Certainly there are days that are very dark, but that does not mean the sun didn't come up, right? So I have really strong evidence that the sun will rise tomorrow based on my past experience. That's a posteriori knowledge, dependent on experience. Right. So if you can see how those things are different. Right. 2 + 2 = 4, right? That does not depend on my experience, but that's independent of experience. Okay. So the main question when it comes to knowledge and ethics is, what can we know about right and wrong or the good, right? Is that something that we can actually know, right? Can we know that something is good? Can we know that something is right or that something is wrong? Do we have the ability to have that knowledge to look at a situation and see, like, see something going on and be able to make a judgment about that and know that that is a good action or a just action or an unjust action? Okay. So back to our fields of philosophy. So we talked about these top 3. I'm going to hold off to talk about the others. Logic, I want to spend a little bit of time on next time, and we'll look at different types of logic, ways of reasoning, and then axiology, which will be theory of value. So we'll talk about those 2 next time, so we'll stop with these first 3, and yes, I think that's all I got today. So hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.